Marlon Brando was halfway through that monologue when he saw the gun, not pointed at him, not yet, just resting on the table in front of a man in the front row, a man whose name you whispered in New York and never spoke out loud. Marlon stopped talking, the musicians kept playing, the audience held its breath, and then Marlon Brando did something that would either make him a legend or get him destroyed. He stepped off the stage, walked straight toward the man, and held the microphone out like an invitation. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Manhattan in 1954. It wasn't the glossy postcard it sells today. It was a city where money moved through back rooms, where nightclubs survived on favors, and where certain men owned the doors. The Waldorf Ballroom where Brando had been invited to speak was respectable, but insiders knew the guest list was written elsewhere. Producers, agents, fixers, and men who never put their names on anything. Marlon knew the rules. You smiled for the cameras, you said the right lines, you shook the right hands, and you never embarrassed the people who could make your next year disappear. He'd learned that before Hollywood started calling him the future. He'd grown up in Illinois, in a house loud with fights, and he'd spent his early years around tough talkers who believed intimidation was a language. Marlon understood those men. He understood what they were capable of, and he understood that in rooms like this, you survived by knowing your place. But Marlon Brando also had something most people didn't have. He had no fear when it came to performing. On stage, Marlon was untouchable, not because he was arrogant, but because he didn't care about impressing anyone. He was there to tell the truth of a moment, and if you didn't like it, that was your problem. This attitude had carried him from theater to film, from unknown kid to headline name. But on that winter night in 1954, it would be tested in a way that nobody could have predicted. The man with the gun didn't smile when Marlon reached his table. He didn't frown either. He just looked up, slowly, like someone deciding whether a problem was worth solving permanently. The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy in your chest. Marlon held the microphone steady, close enough that the man could hear his own breathing echo through the speakers. For a second, everyone thought this was it, that the night would end in panic, headlines, and blood on polished floors. But instead, the man laughed, not loudly, just enough to let everyone know he was amused. He leaned back in his chair, pushed the gun slightly away from the edge of the table, and said something only Marlon could hear. Whatever it was, it made Marlon nod once and return to the stage without another word. The show continued. Applause followed. People pretended nothing had happened, but backstage, the story had already begun spreading. By the time the YS night ended, everyone in Manhattan's inner circles was asking the same question. Who did Marlon Brando think he was? To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand what Brando represented at the time. Hollywood was built on polish. Stars were clean, obedient, controlled. They smiled when told, spoke when written for, and stayed silent when things got ugly. Marlon Brando broke that system just by existing. He mumbled his lines. He rejected scripts. He showed up late, questioned directors, and refused to pretend he was anyone other than what he was. Studio executives hated him for it. Audiences loved him for it. He wasn't safe, and that made him electric, but it also made him dangerous to protect. After a streetcar named Desire and On the Waterfront, Marlon wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a symbol of something changing, a man who didn't bow. And symbols are fragile things in cities run by power. That night in the ballroom wasn't about a gun. It was about control, about reminding a rising star that no matter how famous you were, there were still men who decided how far you could go. Most actors would have laughed it off later, grateful to walk away intact. Marlon didn't. Hours after the event, he was still replaying the moment in his head, the weight of the microphone, the look in the man's eyes, the realization that fear only works if you accept it. And from that night on, Marlon Brando quietly made a decision. If the world was going to try to own him, he would make sure it never truly could. When the curtain finally fell, the room exhaled like it had been underwater. Glasses clinked again. Laughter returned, forced at first, then louder. But the fear never fully left. It followed everyone into the hallway, into black sedans idling outside, into conversations whispered instead of spoken. Marlon didn't stay to celebrate. He changed quietly, avoided eye contact, and let left through a side door like someone who knew the night wasn't finished yet. In the weeks that followed, stories spread. Some said the man with the gun had been testing him. Others said it was a warning meant for the studio executives who thought Brando was becoming unmanageable. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. Power doesn't like being ignored, and Marlon Brando had ignored it in front of witnesses. At the time, Hollywood was tightening its grip. Contracts were ironclad. Publicists controlled every sentence a star spoke. Actors who stepped out of line found themselves suddenly unavailable, uncast, quietly erased. Marlon had already caused problems. He skipped rehearsals. He questioned authority. He spoke about politics when actors were supposed to stay decorative. The industry tolerated him because he was brilliant, but brilliance only buys you time. What made Marlon different was that he never seemed interested in protecting himself. He didn't network. He didn't charm executives. He didn't apologize. He lived like someone who assumed tomorrow would take care of itself. That attitude terrified the people who made their living predicting outcomes. The incident in Manhattan became a quiet checkpoint. Doors didn't close overnight, but they stopped opening as easily. Scripts arrived slower. Meetings felt colder. Smiles came with conditions. Marlon noticed. He always noticed. But instead of adjusting, he leaned further into himself. He chose stranger roles. He pushed directors harder. He demanded honesty in scenes that made everyone uncomfortable. And with each success, the tension grew. Because every time Marlon Brando won, it proved something the system didn't want to admit. That talent could outweigh control. That authenticity could scare power more than rebellion. And somewhere deep down, the men who ruled those rooms understood something else too. Marlon wasn't trying to challenge them. He simply didn't believe they mattered. Years later, people would say that Marlon Brando's downfall was inevitable, that a man who refused to be managed couldn't survive in a system built on obedience. But that version of the story skips something important. Marlon didn't fall apart all at once. He withdrew, slowly, deliberately. After the Manhattan incident, fame stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like exposure. Every role came with expectations. Every appearance came with invisible strings. The same people who praised his honesty wanted to package it, soften it, sell it back to the public as something harmless. Marlon hated that more than open threats. He retreated into himself, into long silences and sudden disappearances. He moved when he wanted. He spoke when he felt like it. Directors complained. Studios panicked. Journalists speculated. But Marlon remained unreachable. Then came the offers that changed everything. Bigger roles, bigger money, bigger promises of control. He took some of them, ignored others, and surprised everyone when he accepted a role that would turn him into something mythic. When The Godfather arrived, it wasn't supposed to be his redemption. The studio didn't want him. They thought he was unstable, unreliable, dangerous. Marlon knew that. He also knew something they didn't. Power only works if you ask permission. He walked onto that set carrying every warning, every threat, every whispered doubt he'd ever heard, and turned them into something unforgettable. Don Vito Corleone wasn't just a character, he was a reflection, quiet authority, controlled presence. A man who never raised his voice because he never had to. The world watched and called it a comeback. Marlon didn't. To him it was proof that he had survived by refusing to bend, that the night with the gun hadn't broken him, it had clarified him. But clarity comes at a cost, because once you understand that fear is optional, you also understand how alone you really are. By the end of his life, Marlon Brando was spoken about in extremes: genius or nightmare, revolutionary or recluse, a man who changed acting forever, or a man who ran from the world that crowned him. But the truth sits somewhere quieter, in moments most people never saw, in the pauses, in the silences, in the way he chose distance over surrender. That night in Manhattan never made the newspapers. There were no police reports, no photographs, no official record, just a room full of people who understood exactly what had almost happened, and a young actor who realized something irreversible. That respect demanded is weaker than respect ignored. Marlon never told the story himself. He didn't need to. It lived in how he moved through the world afterward, in how he stopped explaining himself, in how he let rumors grow instead of correcting them, in how he treated fame like something temporary, something that could be shed if it became a leash. When he finally withdrew from public life, people called it tragedy. They said he'd wasted his gift, that he'd lost his way. But maybe they were wrong. Maybe Marlon Brando didn't disappear because he was broken. Maybe he disappeared because he had already learned the lesson everyone else was still chasing. That real power isn't loud. It doesn't doesn't threaten, it doesn't beg to be seen. It simply exists, untouched by approval or fear. And somewhere in the memory of a crowded ballroom, with a gun resting quietly on a table and a microphone held steady in his hand, Marlon Brando had already chosen the only ending that made sense.